Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dream Leapers with Harriet Cole. Whenever I have an author, I get extra excited. I've been wanting to write books since I was 12 years old, and my dream came true many times over. And I have an author with me today who had that dream even a little earlier than me. She actually wrote her first book when she was 11 years old. She has had a passion for storytelling. She's been writing books since she was 11 and has written quite a few books. When I met her, she was an intern working with me when she was still in high school, and she had a coterie of books that she had written, but now she has published a book. So she is Alex Travis. She holds a BA in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania and a PhD in school psychology from the University of Maryland. She's currently based in Virginia, where she shares her home with her husband, a vast collection of Funkos, and an extensive library of books. So her debut book, novel, The Only Black Girl in the Room, was released on May 7th, and it follows Genevieve Francis, a young Black reporter navigating career challenges and personal conflicts, delving into themes of ambition, race, and the pursuit of success amidst adversity. It's a good read, very well written. You know how much I love that. Please join me in welcoming Alex Travis.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, I'm so proud of you. That's what I want to tell you. Congratulations. It takes a lot to birth it and get it out into the world, right?
Yes.
So good for you. So I want to go back to let folks know, I have had interns since I started working in New York, because before I got to New York, how I got here was to create internships for myself. And so I pledged that I would always have interns. And you went to Scarsdale High School, and I worked with your school for probably 20 years, having students to come through your senior options program to work with me for weeks leading up to you heading off to college. So I want to start with that experience back then, because when I met you, as I said, you knew you were going to be a writer. That was like a done deal. You've been doing it for a long time. Uh, what made you know?
It truly was just one day. I was 11 and I sat down and was like, "I'm gonna write a book." And that was it. It just happened one day, and then it became something that I was just so passionate about, but I feel like it wasn't even the when you know you know. It was just, "We're doing it." And here we are.
And what was the first book about, Alex?
The first book was about Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII. I went through a real Tudor history phase, at around age
11?
11. Yes. So I was inspired and I always wanted to write about strong women. And I had read about her and was like, she sounds like a cool person to try and write about.
And so that first book, how many pages would you say it was?
I feel like it was probably like maybe 200
Oh my goodness.
handwritten. So I still have it in a box. It's in like a binder.
Wow. And then from there, you wrote a number of other books. What were the other books as you were bumping along from middle school to high school?
I did a lot of young adult,
Mhm.
some fantasy kind of in there, but I always gravitated towards that young adult space. So they kind of really ran the gambit. So a lot of those, and those were good practice for as I got ready to actually do this and, have a book be out there in the world.
And so your process, and I'm asking all these questions because just about everybody wants to write a book.
Mhm.
Many people talk about it and don't ever do it. It's scary to write a book for a lot of people. What do I do first? How do I even start? And you started as a child and kept going. So young adults, that certainly is a big category. You also, when you were younger, you were a child and then a teenager, writing for an audience just a little bit older than you. Did you do research? Were you just writing? Like, what were you doing?
It was a lot of just writing, very much free flow and just sitting down and having ideas and stories I wanted to tell, but I didn't do a lot of plotting or anything. I just kind of sat down and let it take me where it may.
And what did you do with those books?
I still have them, so I have, a box full of all the notebooks, so I haven't done anything formally with them, but I still have them, and it's fun to look back at them and see the different things I was writing, especially because that's when I was, that age that I was writing for, so getting an idea of, "Oh, where were you, when you were 14, 15? What were you thinking about these things?"
Did you ever share them with other people, like, or were they just tucked away?
I shared them with some friends in high school, so some people kind of got to see some of them, yeah, for sure.
Well, you didn't try to get them published at that point.
I did a little bit, but I didn't really understand the process, so I had reached out to a few agents, no bites, but I didn't get really serious about that process until probably college.
It's so interesting. When my daughter was in high school, so it's after you, she's younger than you are, and things change so much from year to year, and I don't know how much younger she is than you, but maybe about 10 years. And, when she was in high school, they were writing books on TikTok, I think.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
there was this section, I think it was TikTok, it was one of the social media things. You could write a book, it was a serial book, and they often used influencers as, like, their, inspiration.
Ah,
And at one point, she told me she had written, like, 500 pages, and she had followers and, like, hundreds of followers. It's like, "What are you talking about?" So it got it advanced to
yes.
that point where you could create an audience and start to develop your craft.
Mhm.
When I wrote my first book, which was a book of poetry, I literally hid it in my closet in a shoebox in my bedroom because I was too nervous to share it with anybody. So I guess throughout the evolution, you at least shared yours with some friends. And then, so when you went to college, what did you major in?
I majored in psychology, and then I had a minor in creative writing and Africana studies.
Why psychology?
That was just one of those when you know, you know. I was in high school and I knew that I wanted to work with people. I liked the idea of psychology, and I took a psychology class with our mutual friend, Rashid. And I was like, I think this is really my avenue. So I went in and I just knew right away, like, I'm going to start taking psychology classes. Let's see this through.
And so now you work in the space of school psychology, is that right? What does that mean?
So my role is basically I'm school based. I work in elementary schools right now, but technically I could work with kids, as young as probably 2 all the way up to young adults. So I do a lot of testing for special education services. So if we suspect a disability, I do a lot of that cognitive and behavioral testing. I also do some counseling, some consultation. So it's very flexible kind of within the school setting of getting to use some of those psychology principles, but also getting to do some assessment and things like that as well.
That's fascinating. I have a friend who, just retired, who did similar work to
Mhm,
what you're doing, the testing
mhm,
on all different levels. I guess it's all around placement, but also figuring out where a child is. And I'm curious now, I
mhm,
feel like there's a lot more sensitivity in the evaluation process for
mhm.
students at younger ages, where if you can catch something that might be different about them, there's an opportunity to support them better. What can you talk about that whole space of identifying differences and working with students?
Yes. So I, before grad school, worked in an autism research lab. So I
Mm.
worked as a research assistant, and we were doing studies with kids as young as 6 months up to like 4 or 5 years old. So I got a lot of experience with the really young kids and saw the benefits of early intervention, particularly for things like autism. Now, kind of in my school role, it's similar. The kids are a bit older, but a lot of it is, someone's having trouble in school. Can we kind of figure out what's going on? Is it something going on academically? Is it behavioral? Is it, some kind of cognitive processing deficit? Like really kind of trying to tease it out. But I think that also coming in with that psychology knowledge of kids are kids.
Mhm.
Sometimes our expectations are not flexible enough for what is, typical behavior. So also being that person who can come in and say, hey, just because this kindergartner isn't sitting all day doesn't mean that there's a disability. What are some other ways that we can intervene? So I kind of come in, I do the testing, but I also am the person on the front end who's like, hey, pump your brakes. We need to get more evidence. We need to try more interventions. Let's not jump straight to this is a disability.
That's very good to hear.
Mhm,
I think one of the pushbacks that we hear in education, not just education, but as it relates to this, especially for children of color, children in neighborhoods that are less wealthy than others, where the advantages may not be as broad, children are often labeled
mhm,
as problem children, whatever it might be, when there could be other reasons. I do a lot of coaching, particularly with people in the entertainment industry, and have worked with a lot of young people, especially during the pandemic, very young, who were coming out with music, young teenagers
mhm,
from all different parts of the country, including very small communities of color. And time and again, I would talk to students who were really challenged with communication skills, the ability to say whatever it was they were thinking, but they were being advanced. And what they would tell me is, well, I got advanced because I didn't fight. I
mhm,
wasn't a troubled child. I was a good kid. So they just kept pushing me along because I wasn't the kid who was causing trouble.
mhm.
Do you see that?
I see that less now, and especially because I'm in that earlier space.
Mhm,
But where I am in Virginia, we're, doing new things like looking at kind of multi-tiered systems of support. So basically having, the assessments and tests, those state assessments that are done every year, and then
mhm,
using those to tier students to see, who may need more support, who may need more intervention, and trying to come in a little bit earlier of, hey, you scored below this benchmark on this assessment. Maybe you need, some additional help with reading. So we're going to put you in an additional reading group and
mhm.
trying to take it through those interventions first. And then if those aren't working, then that's when people come to me and say, hey, we suspect a disability. So trying to address it a little bit earlier. But I've definitely seen with kids of color in particular, and when you throw in behaviors, it becomes a
Mhm.
whole thing of, oh, this must be a disability. And it's like sometimes behavior is just behavior, and we need to figure out a way to address it. And so many different things can go into it. And it can be difficult for a lot of people to really step away from this behavior is disruptive and it's causing a problem in the classroom to how can we better understand this behavior and work through a way to fix it. It's not going to be a quick fix, it's not going to happen overnight, but what can we do?
And what can you do or have you done if it feels like among peers, professionals, that the assessment seems like it's looking through a racist lens?
Mhm. I am pretty quick to call it out.
Mhm,
So that's just kind of my personality. If I think that something is coming from a racist lens, I will bring it up. Or if I'm not comfortable bringing it up in the moment, I'm very lucky to have where I work. One of my supervisors is a black man, so reaching out to him, being like, "Hey, this thing happened. It made me feel uncomfortable. I want to address it, but I also want to figure out the best way to address it within this system." So, especially because when it's something like assessment, that is my area, I feel much more comfortable kind of being like, hey, like, let's pump the brakes and pointing out the different lenses that we should look through. And then I think it's also really helpful just being a Black woman myself. I feel
mhm.
like parents respond to me differently, especially the parents of color. And they express their reservations about the process, and we really talk them through it. And I am not one to rush in and say, this is a disability just because that seems like the easiest way to get services. So I'm definitely someone who tries to interrupt those conversations as best I can.
Well, hallelujah to that. I'm so happy to hear because they all always talk about having a representative in the room. If you got
Mhm.
somebody in the room who's at least had some of those experiences, it makes it easier for that to be addressed. Let me remind folks, this is Dream Leapers with Harriet Cole. We are talking to Alex Travis, and I am holding in my hand her new book. It is called The Only Black Girl in the Room. It is a novel, and I want to talk to you about your book, Alex, just as we were talking about in your work.
Mhm.
It's still often true in professional environments that there's just one or few people of color, even now in 2024. So, but your book looks at the life of a fictional character, but a Black woman who's a journalist, and a lot of the challenges that she faces both in her personal life and in her work life. So, can you describe Genevieve, and how did you come up with her as a character?
So I feel like I came up with the situations first. So initially, I came up with what people will see in the book as the prologue. So this idea of a long-term relationship kind of on the rocks, and there is a disastrous proposal gone wrong. And so I had that idea, and then I had the idea that maybe that person would come back into Genevieve's life a few years later. And then I also had the idea of, because when I was writing this book, it was, my initial foray into the workplace as a Black woman, and I was frequently the only Black woman in the room, and taking some of those experiences and embedding them in the book as well. So I knew that I wanted to have kind of a mid-20s character, someone early in their career who was trying to navigate and figure out, what is it that I want to do? What do I want to do with my voice? What do I want to do with my career? And how do I get past these roadblocks? And so Genevieve is very much, that young, ambitious woman who is trying to figure out, how can I do what I want to do within the confines of this society, and particularly the confines of this workplace that I'm in, where it really seems like people don't want to let me succeed here.
Which is a question that seems like just about every young professional has, and I'm gonna say I'm from a different generation. My generation had it too. It's tough. It's tough to figure out how to build a career as fast as you think you deserve to build it.
Mhm.
It's tough when people around you seem to be progressing faster than you, especially if you're a person of color.
Mhm.
And so let's talk about that. As you and we're not going to give away everything in the book, but you can share some bits. But like, what kinds of situations have you put Genevieve in the workplace that help to show when she's seeing something for what it is and when maybe she's not?
So definitely situations where, she's assigned articles and expected to come at those articles from a specific lens, that some of her white coworkers have for different stories. Um, Also, just not feeling like she's advancing at the same rate as her white peers, and noticing just the differences in the stories that they're getting, despite her having more experience prior to coming into the newsroom than some of those coworkers. So just that unequal division of work, and then doing a lot of the smaller things like copy editing, or being asked to fix the copy machine when it's broken, a lot of those little things that happen in the workplace that can kind of remind you, hey, we don't necessarily see you on our level. You're at this kind of lower level and you have to work your way up. But then at the same time, can you ever really work your way up? And what are the strings that come with that?
So exploring that on paper, especially for, I mean, are you calling this for young adults? It's for everybody, but it
Yeah,
has a bit of a young adult
for
feel.
it's more for adults,
Mhm,
but definitely I feel like, millennials, young people will identify with that early career,
mhm.
portion, but I think too, anyone who's kind of gone through that, can remember those times.
Absolutely. I mean, I've read it and totally remember. I remember just feeling like, I am smart. I did so well in school. I should be able to do whatever. The
Mhm,
sky's the limit. I should be making this much money. I should be having all kinds of opportunities that took quite a while to come.
mhm,
Because when you're first starting your career, you think, well, of course I should have everything.
mhm,
And then the reality check comes in, right? Which is interesting. Now, in terms of the love life
mhm.
of Genevieve, so she, uh she's in an interracial relationship
Mhm.
that's also uh, what how their economic
Mhm.
socioeconomic status is very different from each other, and that was a bit bumpy
Mhm.
and remains a bit bumpy. But but you take us through what feels very, very real.
Mhm.
Now, is there any correlation between Genevieve's story and yours?
I would say more on the workplace front than the relationship front. So
Yes.
I'm also in an interracial relationship. We don't have the same, class differences. Um, and I think that my husband really came in with because he's trained as an historian. So he had a lot of that knowledge already. I didn't necessarily have to kind of teach him in the same way that Genevieve sometimes has to teach Jude. But even just the day to day, sometimes of just I know these things happen. Like, for example, if I'm followed in a store, it's like he knows that, but then it's like, okay, what can you do in this moment? How can you interrupt this moment? And I think that's something that we've had to work on.
And so that I'm very curious about that kind of situation, like everyday microaggressions that
Mhm,
happen to Black people that many people, I will say, especially if you're in the same so-called class, your friends, spouse, whoever it might be, who are not of your background, often don't even believe that it happens to
mhm,
you, to me, that it happens to poor people, disadvantaged people, people who come from whatever kind of community. And I mean, I've had people argue with me, Alex, to say,
mhm,
I do not believe that a taxi wouldn't stop for you in New York City. And I'm like, oh, yeah, it still happens. It even happened during COVID when nobody was outside.
mhm.
So these weird things happen. So when your husband has observed that, was it just like incredulous for him that it actually happened? Like, as a historian, he'd heard about it, but then witnessing it, what was that like for him at first?
I think definitely witnessing it, took a moment to be like, "Hey, wait a minute." And it was like that recognition because he would recognize it, but then it was kind of like, what action do you take? But even things like, in one of my old apartments, one day we were, coming up to the apartment and legitimately like someone ran away. And I am, not I am a small person. And
Yes,
he's just
you
looking
are.
like, what on earth is
And a
this?
woman.
Yes. So, like, some things like that, but I think especially now and because he's seen a lot of my experiences, he gets it right away, and it's just kind of that thing of when you're in those situations, what action can you take because you are, a taller white man?
And in your book,
Mhm.
when you share these kinds of experiences, what are you hoping the reader is gonna come away with? If it's someone who, you know, like your husband, hadn't observed it or experienced it before.
I hope just having a deeper understanding and recognizing these things happen. And I know that a lot of it happens in the book, and it seems like it's back to back to back. But especially as a Black woman in the workplace, sometimes it really is like that. People don't always believe it, but then when you're talking about your experience, it's like, oh, yeah, this really happened, day 1, day 2, day 3. So I think that getting a deeper understanding for how some of those little things can happen, what happens when other people around overlook them, and the impact that that can have on the people it's happening to. And I think sometimes that ends up getting lost of we recognize like, hey, that's a microaggression, but then, do you recognize just the toll that that takes over time, having to deal with it over and over and over?
Which I think I appreciate that you layer it in your book the way that you do, because so many people think, well, you just complain too much. Why would you, can't you just, this is not such a big deal. Why are you still talking about it? Just brush it off your shoulder and keep moving. I remember, Alex, when I was in college. So this is, 10,000 years ago at Howard University. And there was a group of Nigerian students that I befriended. And so I will date myself because it's important. Ronald Reagan was president. And
Mhm,
so Reaganomics, trickle down
mhm,
economics was a thing. And it was very beneficial to wealthy people and not to others. And there were lots of things that were questionable about his offerings. And this group of Nigerian guys were we were debating Reaganomics and what was good or bad about it, and they were so for it because it could make a lot of money. They're
Mhm.
like, "We are here to get rich. We are here to make a lot of money. Why do all of you Black people complain all the time? Why don't you just make money and shut up?" And this is Black people, African, but Black people. And I remember thinking, "You just don't understand. Your experience is so different."
Mhm.
And I do think, however, sometimes we are crippled by our experiences. I
Mhm.
do think sometimes, our level of sensitivity can potentially get in the way, because if you could have blinders on and not see it, well, then what would happen? But is that the way to live?
Mhm.
It's a hard thing so what are your thoughts on that?
I think definitely it's interesting to see when you bring class into it as well and money. I come from a wealthy background, but it still happens. I feel like when I was younger, I didn't necessarily recognize it, even though I was in predominantly white environments. And I think I went to college, and when I was in college, that was when Trayvon Martin happened, Ferguson happened at the same time as well. So it was just kind of like I knew cognitively these things went on. I knew that I had some of those experiences, but I feel like in college, it really opened my eyes of, oh, this happens just on an everyday basis.
Mm.
And I think then that's when I started also getting into debates. So you got into some debates. I was definitely in some debates. I remember maybe my sophomore or junior year of college, I ended up in a Facebook debate with someone because someone else that we knew had posted like a BuzzFeed list of examples of white privilege. And a white guy hopped on after I commented. It wasn't even my post, and just like went after me, on a class basis of, well, like, I don't believe these things would have happened to you because of class. And then was like, if they have, like, I want you to prove each of these points.
Ooh.
And I was young and much more energetic than I feel now. And it's like 1 in the morning, and I am going through point by point. I was taking sociology at the time, so I'm linking to sociology studies. So definitely still having, that debate as well. And I did, it was obviously a crazy experience. But people, did reach out to me after, and they were grateful that we had that conversation. And I think that everything is so intertwined, but you do have to look at those different privileges. So I have privileges in many ways. And then in other ways, I experience a lot of very similar, racism as someone who would have, who comes from a less advantaged socioeconomic background. So it really is, I think, interesting and kind of sobering when you think about, you know, people will say, you make money, you get this job, you move up in this way, and these things won't happen, but they still do. And that money doesn't really offer you a protection from the greater systemic racism.
I think it's good that you come from the background that you have so that you can debunk some of those myths.
Mhm,
There definitely is a belief that if you have enough resources, especially for those who've grown up wealthy, that you're in a bubble
mhm,
and those things don't happen to you. But, we have so many examples. Dr. Henry Louis Gates was about to be arrested on his front lawn. I
mhm,
mean, not only is he one of the most privileged professors in the world, I mean, he's at Harvard, and he was in front of his house. Come on. I
mhm,
remember, Butch Graves, who now runs Black Enterprise, and his father, of course, created Black Enterprise, Earl Graves. Butch was driving home I think he lived in Scarsdale, or somewhere around there, and he was in a fancy car. The police pulled him over and were, harassing him. He didn't get hurt, but, it is humiliating
mhm,
and it is real, and privilege does not prevent these things from happening, even the worst things,
mhm,
being shot, being killed, certainly being humiliated happens all the time. So I appreciate not only that you have the awareness of what your experience is, but, you have a lot of it written in this book
mhm.
so that people, and I think fiction really helps people to look
Yes.
at things, to examine things, to consider things that otherwise might make them feel uncomfortable. Let me remind folks, this is Dream Leapers with Harriet Cole, and the book in question is called The Only Black Girl in the Room. It is written by Alex Travis. This is her first publicly published book, but she has been writing books since she was 11 years old. I love that. And so will you say your age?
Yes, I'm 30, about to be 31.
So at 30 years old, she's published her first book. She knew that she was going to write books. She wrote books since she was 11. So this is a thing that's very similar for us. I was 1 year older. I knew from when I was 12 that I wanted to write books and I was interested in fashion. And I combined those two things in my career over all these years. But my first book I did not publish until I was 32, a little older than you, because it takes time.
Mhm.
It takes time to be, I think, good enough as a writer for people to want to read, even if you're writing all that time. What for you, what do you think took the time to get to the point of actually publishing the book?
I think a lot of time, a lot of practice, figuring
Mhm.
out the right story. So I definitely had, close calls or maybe interest with previous books, but this was the first one where it really seemed to connect. And that was kind of that, impetus for me to pursue it further. But I think that it really was just taking the time to hone my craft, taking in as much feedback as I could get, and then, taking it out wide and now having it published.
Which is exciting on so many fronts. When you first got the book in your hand, what was that experience like?
It was very exciting. I got the, advanced copies first, and then I just got the hardcover copies probably like 2 weeks ago. So definitely very, very exciting. And just like, wow, it's here. I get to hold it. It is a real physical book, and just that excitement. And then also getting to, start to share it.
Are you going to do a book tour?
I don't think a formal tour, but, doing some stops, doing some events, but not a formal tour that I know of.
Yeah, well, they don't happen the way that they used to.
Mhm.
However, there's so many opportunities, especially because of the internet,
Yes.
to get the word out. Uh, I wanna talk about the news that you just shared with me, which is super so the book, I'm gonna say this is your first baby, right? This this book that is how many pages? Like
100
350
something?
pages, something
Yeah.
like that, almost 350 pages. So that's your heart and soul, and how long did it take to write this book?
It took a few years, but it was very stop and start. So,
Mhm,
I'd start writing it and it was something that I always kept coming back to. So
mhm.
I knew I liked the story and I would write some and then kind of fall off and write some. But then in 2020, publishing houses were doing more open submissions, particularly for Black authors. So that was really an impetus for me of, oh, I want to submit this. I want to see how it goes. So then I was like, all right, got to sit down and really finish it.
And so that's interesting because, 2020 is when the pandemic happened and everybody's at home, and at first, it was complete contraction. And then we got to the point of being able to use these services like Zoom and StreamYard and all of these to be able to connect to people uh, across space, to use technology to connect to people. And I think, like you said, publishers made this open call. There was an openness to try things that are different
Mhm.
because everything was different.
Yes.
So were you still working? Were you at the school working at that point? What was your work life in 2020?
I was still in grad school,
Ah,
so the pandemic hit March 2020. I was in my 2nd year of grad school. So 2nd and 3rd year, for the most part, were completely virtual, and then we kinda started transitioning back in my 4th year. So, yeah, I was in the middle of grad school working on my thesis and then my dissertation, and then I also had the books as well, mostly
and
'cause
so
of procrastinating.
how, um, how long is the graduate program to get the PhD?
So mine was 5 years minimum, so 4 years of coursework and then a 5th year of internship.
Wow, okay, and in the middle of that, you got married.
Yes,
When did you get married?
in 2022. So we were supposed to get married in 2020, and then the pandemic happened, so it ended up getting pushed off.
because you got married just when people were coming out again. It
Mhm.
was not long after people started creeping out of their house. "We wanna be together." Then you had this beautiful wedding.
Yes.
Um, and so what's the news?
That I'm expecting our first child.
Yay, congratulations. That is so exciting.
Yes.
And so how does that feel? I mean, you've had a lot of accomplishments. You got a PhD before age 30. Hello. And got married, and now you're having a baby. This is a lot of accomplishments back to back.
Just like, throwing them all together and knocking them out of the way, but it's definitely very exciting, and an exciting next step to take with our family.
So, I remember when I was pregnant, and I had my daughter much, much later in life than you, but I remember feeling like I've got all these things happening, career, but I was working on a lot of different things, and then I was pregnant. Oh boy, how am I gonna be able to do all of these things? Does that thought cross your mind now?
I think a bit, but especially because, it's the middle of the school year, so it's just like I'm still doing my things. I'm still going in every day. It's just, maybe a little bit more tired. I was joking with people because I'm definitely one of the, school staff who doesn't matter what I'm wearing, I will get on the floor with a kid, like we'll be eye level. So I said I'd be really sad, when I hit the third trimester and I'm not able to be
Or
down.
maybe you can.
Maybe, fingers crossed.
You never know.
I just have
You
to get back up after that. That might be the
well,
problem.
there's that. So working with children and you work with young children, does that inspire you as you're pregnant about what it's gonna be like to have your own?
I think to some degree, and it'll be really interesting because I've heard people say, I was the greatest, parent and school psychologist in the world before I had kids. So I think it'll be interesting to see a lot of the things that I have said or advice that I have given, how much of that I end up taking into parenting my own child.
It there's nothing like having your own child. I
Yes.
mean, it's just a totally different, experience, but because you work with children, I just can imagine that there's so many rich experiences that you have that you'll be able to bring to the relationship with your own that give perspective and everything.
Yes, and I mean, working with kids, they're especially young kids, they're hilarious. They say absolutely ridiculous, funny things all the time. So it's also just even the days where it's really hard or where, a kid is screaming in the middle of the hallway, there's always still those really fun moments. And I feel like that's a good reminder for parenthood too, of just there are going to be moments that are really, really challenging, but the joy is worth it. And they will always find ways to surprise you and bring you that extra joy.
So, how are you and your husband preparing for bringing this child into the world?
Definitely, trying to figure out space and life and daycare and all of those things. So it's a lot of the logistical preparation. And then I feel like as we get closer, it'll kind of be more of that rush into, okay, what are we doing? Because it's something that we've talked about a lot. We've talked about a lot of the ideas of how we want to raise a kid together, different values we want them to have. But now it's more of the, oh, what are the practical things to keep a small person alive that we need to have?
Well, and if correct me if I'm wrong, but you do not live near your family, is that correct?
Not super close, probably within 4 hours.
Yeah.
So not too far. It's kind of easy to get there, but not, right on top of them.
Yeah, we same here. My family's in Baltimore, where you all were living for a while, and I'm in New York. That is way too far for, "Oh, mom, can you come watch my kids?" Although she would come when during the fashion collections, twice a year, my mother would come and stay with my daughter when both of us were out and about, but, you know, that was unusual. Unlike my sister in Baltimore who had both sets of grandparents for her children growing up, she never had to hire a babysitter.
Wow.
Never. I mean, that's like, and she's a very active, professional, but there was always a family member able to watch her kids. It's totally different for most people. So have you started the research for a nanny already or whatever you're gonna do?
Well, we've looked up some, daycares and things like that.
Daycare?
We have a bit of time, just with the way that, I'm able to stack leave and then my husband also gets leave. So doing that so we won't have to worry about daycare for, a bit of time.
Well, good. Okay, I wanna go back to the book, Only Black Girl in the Room. What are you hoping that the reader will come away with? This I could see this book as being, but it is getting warm, right? Thank goodness. And I could see people reading this book on the beach this summer, reading it on the train as they're going into work. Will there be an audiobook
There is an audiobook. Yes.
already? Are
Yeah.
you reading?
No, I am not.
Okay. And so also listening, what do you hope people will be the takeaways from your book?
I think just having a deeper understanding of, the experiences of Black women in the workplace, and also just taking away the idea of second chances and being willing to work on yourself and being willing to, acknowledge progress, acknowledge change, but also really work for that change as well.
Mhm. And if you are not a woman of color and you're reading it, what is a potential ally to gain?
I think just gaining that understanding and hopefully feeling empowered to, if you see these situations happening in your workplace, being willing to, speak up or interrupt those moments. Because it is also difficult being the only Black girl in the room and then also being the only person who's willing to bring up those difficult conversations. And so I think that allyship isn't just noticing when these things are happening, it's also being willing to be, an active interrupter when those things are happening.
Alex, that is a good point in thinking about the actual workplace. And during the pandemic, because George Floyd was murdered during that time, there was a heightened awareness
Mhm,
about how do we treat each other in the workplace. Diversity, equity, and inclusion became buzzwords
mhm.
during the pandemic, and many, many corporations spent millions of dollars trying to help their teams understand how they could engage each other better, how they could be more responsible human beings, and uh, be more respectful, and to be allies when that wasn't the case. And I think I think first of all, that sort of waned. A
Mhm.
lot of companies say, check, I did that. I don't need to do it anymore. But to when looking at the positive, there are companies that made an effort and that are still making an effort. As a psychologist, even though you're working with little kids now, but you have the broad lens of psychology. What recommendations could you give to adults, professionals in the workforce about looking through the lens of DEI today?
I think shifting away from the focus of, diversity as a numbers game, or we need, X many people, or I see that, there's this many people here, boom, diversity, and really shift that to that equity piece of, you may have a diverse staff right now, but what are you doing to retain them? What are you doing to make them feel comfortable and affirmed in this environment? And I think that that's the real gap right now. We're working on some of the numbers, and in some places, there truly aren't very many
Right.
people of color at all. And I think in that case, yes, definitely we need to bring people on, but it's also about keeping them, promoting them, and making sure that they feel like this is an environment where they can thrive. And then when you do that, more people will come. You will find more diverse candidates. You will bring in people with varied experiences, but you have to do the legwork to make sure that those people feel like this is a safe environment for them.
I think that's excellent advice. There's a woman, very well-known executive in finance, Carla Harris.
Mhm,
If you're aware of her, and I interviewed her recently. She was a managing director at Morgan Stanley for many years, and I think she still works with them. But she talked about what you were just addressing, and that especially when you're bringing a person of color into an organization, hoping that they're going to be able to do a great job, that they are bringing skills and knowledge that you want. that you have to surround them with people who are going to help them win.
Mhm.
Because if you just throw them in there, they don't know the culture. They don't know the culture, and the team that's already there doesn't know their culture.
Mhm.
And so then it's like, oh, you all are supposed to work together, but you don't have the tools. And she talks about, how does she describe it? Like if you got an organ transplant,
Mhm.
before you leave the operating room, you have all these medications that you're given to ensure that your body will take the organ and that you'll be healthy.
Mhm.
She likened it to that. So if you want this relationship to work, you need all of these supports around that person and around each other in order for it to work. And she said that a lot of companies don't even think like that. They're like,
Mm.
I hired this great smart person, check,
Yep.
and they're going to do these things, check, and it needs to happen. And then she said, yeah, it was so interesting, Alex. Like if 15 people interview the person and said, oh, she's great, he's great, and then a couple months later the person's not great, she said, you cannot blame the person, you blame the 15 people. What did they not do right?
Mhm.
That was really profound.
Yeah.
And there's so much more to be done. Psychology certainly helps. You spent all those years getting that education. Do you see yourself continuing with children? When you look out at the big picture, this is still the beginning of your career.
Mhm.
What what do you envision your trajectory to be?
I love working with kids. I think I'm gonna do it as long as I can. And I think it also just helps really being on the ground, being in the school and seeing those different things, and then also being willing to be the person who goes to the higher ups and has those conversations of, "Hey, here are the things that I'm noticing. What can we do about it?" And I
Mhm.
think that sometimes, especially when you're not actively practicing, sometimes you miss out on that lens just because 'cause you're not there every day. But since I am really embedded, I think that it offers me a unique position to get to work with the kids, get to have that fun stuff, but then also to be an advocate in a larger way within the systems that I'm operating in.
Do you ever imagine making your own school?
I don't think so. That's very much an administrator.
Right, that's true.
I'd rather work within the system and try and make it better as opposed to creating something entirely new.
Which, each is difficult. Working within a system, it's a system that
Mhm.
exists already. So I think they're both interesting and challenging, and to be committed to helping systems to improve is huge.
Mhm.
It's definitely that's a big thing. Okay, so Alex, this is book number 1 to be published. When I asked you about the getting this deal, I thought I heard you say books plural.
Mhm.
Is there another book that you're working on right now?
Yes, so I will have, a young adult mystery coming out in spring, summer 2025,
Ooh.
with Source Books. It's called The Payback Girls. So that will be coming out, and then I'll have another book with Source Books coming out in 2026.
So what is that process like for you? Because I remember for me, writing books, you have to go full immersion.
Mhm.
And when you have a job, you're going full immersion there. You are about to have a baby, which is full immersion. What's the strategy? What's the plan going to be to be able to complete all of these?
Well, one of them is completed. We're more in the editing stages now, but I definitely just try and figure out how to manage my time. So very much as I can, my day job is my day job. We're doing it at work. Trying our best not to bring it home. Sometimes we have to,
Sure.
um, and then using that home time as the writing time, as well as weekends and things like that. And then you bring a baby into it. That makes it more difficult. I'm guessing, nap times, late night feedings, probably try and knock some things out. But it's also great that I have a very supportive husband who's willing to, take those duties as well and, take the baby so that I can get some work done.
And you said he's a historian. Does he work in an academic setting as well?
No, he works for the government. So he's in the Department of Commerce.
Wow.
Yes.
So interesting. Well, I can't wait to hear about how all of it pans out. This is very exciting. And, just for me, having known you when you were 18 years old to
Mhm.
see what you have done in these, you know, for you, it probably feels like a lot of years, but it's also a blink. This is very exciting. I'm so proud of you. Congratulations.
Thank
And
you
I
so
hope
much.
I hope everybody picks up a copy of The Only Black Girl in the Room. Thank you, Alex. Good luck with everything, and I can't wait to hear all about this new baby. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Hey guys, yes, I'm so glad you tuned in today. I want you to pick up a copy of Alex Travis's book right away, The Only Black Girl in the Room. It's a great read. You'll see she's been honing her craft for all these years, and you can tell the book is very well written, and the stories, many stories in here about this young woman's life, are compelling. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.